Seeking God every day, the lesson that changed Luke's life. Lucas always looked forward to Sunday service. It was the moment when he felt closest to God, surrounded by songs that touched his soul and messages that set his faith on fire. During worship, he felt a deep warmth in his chest, as if he were wrapped in the Father's arms. Every word of praise seemed to echo inside him, bringing peace and an inexplicable sense of belonging. But as soon as the service ended and he returned to his routine, that flame began to fade. The intense emotion gave way to an empty feeling, and Lucas wondered why he couldn't keep that connection alive every day. The week would begin, bringing with it all the distractions of daily life. Between schoolwork, time with friends, and hours spent on his phone, Lucas noticed that the passion he felt on Sundays seemed to disappear quickly. He tried to rekindle that feeling by praying before bed, but it wasn't the same. He read the Bible, but the words didn't feel as alive as when they were preached from the pulpit. Alone in his room, he felt distant from God, as if that powerful worship experience was out of reach until the next Sunday service. As the days went by, this feeling started to bother him even more. Lucas wanted to keep the connection he experienced at church alive, but he didn't know how. He wondered if his faith was weak or if he was doing something wrong. Did God only speak to him when he was surrounded by worship songs and group prayers? Or did he need to find a new way to experience God's presence in his everyday life? One night, while thinking about this, Lucas remembered how Jesus' disciples followed the Master in every moment, not just during great spiritual encounters, but how could he bring that reality into his own life? He didn't know where to start. The only thing he was sure of was his deep desire to be closer to God, not just on Sundays, but every single day. This restlessness followed him everywhere. During class, at home with his family, and even in casual conversations, Lucas felt something inside him crying out for more. He wanted to experience God in his daily routine, in the little things, but it seemed like that connection kept slipping through his fingers. What did he need to do? How could he keep his faith alive beyond the church walls? As the days passed, his search for answers only grew stronger. He found himself thinking about it all the time. He wanted to find a way to keep the fire burning, without relying solely on Sunday services. But without knowing how, all he had left was a restless heart and a question that wouldn't leave his mind. How can I live out my faith in a constant, everyday way? With that burning question in his heart, Lucas realized he needed to go deeper. Something inside him told him that this journey was just beginning. And even though he didn't know what he would find ahead, he felt that this search could change everything. Lucas began to feel more and more restless. After weeks of trying to keep his connection with God alive, he realized that something felt different. No matter how many times he tried to pray or read the Bible, the emotions he felt at church seemed distant. At night, he knelt beside his bed, searching for the same presence that surrounded him during worship, but everything felt silent. His heart no longer raced like before, the tears wouldn't come, and all that remained was a strange sense of emptiness. Was God still with him, or was he losing his faith without even realizing it? As the days went by, Lucas noticed his frustration growing stronger. He heard other people sharing incredible experiences with God, talking about how they felt his presence powerfully in ordinary moments of their day. But why wasn't that happening to him? Was he doing something wrong? Was his faith not strong enough? These questions echoed in his mind, bringing a deep sense of unease. He wanted to believe that God was there, but without feeling anything, doubt started to creep in. At school, Lucas often found himself lost in thought. During class, he stared at the clock, just waiting for the day to end, feeling trapped in a meaningless routine. When his friends talked about their own struggles, he tried to listen, but his mind was elsewhere. He longed to find God again, to feel that peace that seemed so real on Sundays. But the more he searched, the further away it all seemed. Little by little, doubt turned into a weight he didn't know how to carry. One day, when he got home, Lucas sat on his bed and stared at the ceiling. "God, why are you so far away?" he murmured, not expecting an answer. He had never felt like this before. In the past, when he prayed, he at least felt something, even if it was just a small comfort, in his heart. But now there was only cold silence. What if he was just talking to himself? What if everything he had felt before was nothing more than an illusion created by the church environment? The thought scared him, but he couldn't shake it. As the days passed, Lucas started avoiding his prayers. If God wasn't answering, then what was the point of trying? Opening his Bible felt pointless. The words were there, but they didn't make sense the way they used to. He felt like a ship drifting aimlessly, with no direction and no wind to push him forward. The fire that once burned in his heart on Sundays now felt like nothing more than ashes. It was as if he was trying to hold on to something invisible, something that maybe had never really been there at all. The frustration inside him grew in ways he couldn't even explain. He had always heard that God never abandons his children, that he is always near. But why did he feel so distant now? Was he being punished for something? Was God waiting for him to change before speaking to him again? The questions seemed endless, and each one only pulled him deeper into a sea of uncertainty. Without realizing it, Lucas started pulling away from everything. Deep down, he wanted to believe there was still an answer, that God hadn't left him. But at that moment, all he could feel was an overwhelming absence. He wanted to understand, to find meaning in all of it. But what if there was no answer? What if that feeling never came back? Fear gripped his heart, and for the first time, he wondered if he was truly alone. Lucas started noticing a pattern in his walk with God. Every time he felt that intense emotion during worship, his faith seemed unshakable, strong as a rock. But when those feelings faded, he found himself lost, questioning everything. It was as if his faith was a fire that only burned when there was a strong wind to fuel it. But what about when the wind stopped? Was his relationship with God really that fragile? These questions tormented him, and he began to wonder if he had been chasing the feeling of God's presence more than God himself. Days passed, and Lucas tried to remember the first time he ever felt the presence of God. In that moment, he was certain that God was real. His heart burned, and his whole body was filled with peace. But now, without feeling anything, he started to doubt. Did everything depend on that feeling? If God was truly with him, why did he need to feel something in order to believe? It was as if his faith was tied to a sensory experience, and without that emotional confirmation, he wasn't sure if he even had faith anymore. One night, lying in bed, Lucas closed his eyes and tried to connect with God, but the silence around him felt overwhelming. He longed for that warmth in his chest, that certainty that always came on Sundays, but nothing happened, just emptiness. And that's when he realized he had always trusted his emotions more than the truth of God. If he felt something, he believed. If he felt nothing, he questioned. But was that really faith? Depending on emotional moments to be sure that God was there? This realization scared him. He had always heard that faith meant believing without seeing, trusting without feeling. But in practice, he realized he had never actually lived that way. Every time he witnessed something powerful in church, it was as if his faith was renewed. But once he returned home and faced his daily routine, it all seemed to fade away. Was his faith just a response to the atmosphere of the service? If so, did that mean he had never truly trusted God? Only the emotions that he allowed him to experience? Lucas started paying attention to the people around him. He saw Christians who seemed unshakable, people who faced incredible hardships without showing despair. How did they do it? Did they feel God all the time? Or had they learned something he still didn't understand? With each passing day, he realized there might be something beyond emotion, something deeper, something more real than what he had been experiencing in church. But without knowing what it was, he felt lost between what he wanted to believe and what he actually lived. The frustration was still there, but now it was mixed with a different kind of restlessness. Lucas began to wonder if he had been searching for God the wrong way. Maybe God wasn't distant. Maybe he was just looking in the wrong place. But how could he change that? How could he learn to trust without depending on fleeting emotions? He wanted to understand, to grow, but he didn't know how to take the first step. All he had was this new realization, and more questions than answers. The conflict inside him only grew stronger. Part of him wanted to go back to feeling that emotion, but another part knew he needed to find something more solid. But what was it, and how did he get there? Lucas didn't know. All he knew was that for the first time his search for God was taking a different path, and even though he had no idea where it would lead, he felt that something inside him was about to change. The following Sunday, Lucas arrived at church with a heavy heart. He was still struggling with his doubts, wondering if he would ever understand his faith without relying on emotions. As the worship music filled the room, he realized that, although the songs were beautiful, he didn't feel that same shiver he used to. Was something wrong with him? Had God drifted away? Sitting in the pew, he sighed, trying to focus, but his mind was still trapped in his frustration. When the pastor stepped up to the pulpit, Lucas expected another sermon about victory and revival, but to his surprise, the message that night was exactly what he needed to hear. Many believe that faith means feeling God all the time, the pastor said, scanning the congregation. But what happens when the feelings fade? Does God disappear? Or is it that our faith cannot be based solely on our emotions? Lucas sat up straighter, feeling as if those words were meant just for him. The pastor continued, explaining that true faith doesn't depend on fleeting emotions, but on the truth of God's word. If we trust God only when we feel something, our faith will be as unstable as the waves of the sea, he said, opening the Bible to 2 Corinthians 5:7. For we walk by faith, not by sight. This means we don't need to see, touch, or feel in order to believe. We need to trust, regardless of what we feel. Lucas swallowed hard. It made sense, but it was still difficult to accept. Then the pastor shared an illustration that caught Lucas's attention. Imagine a father teaching his child to ride a bike. At first, he holds on tightly, and the child feels safe knowing the father is there. But at some point, the father lets go and the child feels afraid. Yet even though he can't see or feel his father's hand, the father is still there, ready to help if needed. That's how God is. Just because we don't feel his hand all the time doesn't mean he has abandoned us. Those words lingered in Lucas's mind. For the first time, he began to see his relationship with God differently. Maybe he had been putting more faith in his emotions than in God's faithfulness. All this time, he had been waiting to feel something in order to believe instead of simply trusting what the Bible said. But how could he change that? How could he learn to live by faith in the truth rather than in his emotions? It was a question he didn't have the answer to yet. As he left church that night, Lucas felt different, but not in the way he expected. He wasn't overwhelmed by a rush of emotion, nor had he felt chills during the service. But something inside him seemed to have awakened. A new way of seeing his walk with God was beginning to take shape, even though he was far from understanding it all. For the first time, he realized that maybe his faith didn't need to be led by what he felt, but by what he knew about God. Lucas decided he would apply this lesson, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. How could he trust without feeling? How could he keep going without relying on those emotional experiences? He didn't yet know how to put this into practice, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep living a fragile faith that shifted with his emotions. There was still a long road ahead, and he was only just beginning to understand this new journey. That night when Lucas got home, he couldn't stop thinking about the pastor's sermon. The idea of trusting God even without feeling intense emotions still seemed challenging to him. He recalled all the times he had sought God, expecting to feel something, and when nothing happened, he felt frustrated. But now he was beginning to understand that faith wasn't about fleeting emotions. It was about a constant relationship. Still, he didn't know exactly where to start. How could he strengthen a faith that didn't rely on feelings? The next morning, before even getting out of bed, Lucas made a decision. He would seek God every day, no matter what he felt. It didn't matter if it was a good day or a bad one. If he felt motivated or discouraged, he would open his Bible and pray, even if his mind tried to distract him or his heart felt distant. He knew that at first it might feel mechanical, but he wanted to build a genuine habit. After all, if he couldn't rely on emotions alone, then he needed to rely on God's truth. The first few days were difficult. He would sit on his bed with his Bible open, but his mind would wander. Sometimes the words didn't seem to make sense and his prayers felt dry, lacking the emotion he had always expected to feel. At times he almost gave up, thinking he might be doing something wrong. But then he remembered the pastor's words. Faith isn't about what you feel. It's about trusting God even when you feel nothing. So he kept going, even without immediate results. Over time, Lucas began to notice small changes. They weren't grand spiritual breakthroughs, but he started to feel a sense of peace when reading the Word. Verses that once seemed insignificant now carried meaning. He realized that prayer, even on the hardest days, helped him face challenges with more calmness. It wasn't the emotional rush he had experienced in church services, but it was something deeper, something that made him feel closer to God in a different way. More stable, more real. Lucas also started noticing how distractions pulled him away from his time with God. His phone, the TV, daily worries. Everything seemed to compete for his attention whenever he tried to pray or read the Bible. So, he made some changes. He put his phone on silent, set a fixed time for his devotion, and even found a quiet corner in his room for those moments. Small adjustments, but they made a difference, helping him stay focused on God. Even with this progress, Lucas still faced difficult days. There were moments when doubt crept in, and he wondered if he was truly growing spiritually or just following a routine without purpose. But he chose to keep going. He reminded himself that relationships aren't built overnight. They take time, dedication, and perseverance. He began to see his faith as a seed that needed to be watered every day, even when the fruit wasn't yet visible. Lucas didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was certain. He no longer wanted to depend on fleeting emotions to feel close to God. He wanted to truly know God, not just in moments of great emotion, but also in the silence of everyday life. He was still learning, and he knew this journey wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he was determined to walk by faith, not just by what he felt. What came next he didn't know, but he was ready to keep going. In the first few days, Lucas still missed the intense emotions he used to experience during church services. He wondered if he was truly growing spiritually or just following a lifeless routine. But instead of giving up, He kept going. Little by little, something began to change. He realized that even without chills or tears in his eyes, his mind was more focused on God. When he faced challenges, his first reaction was no longer to panic, but to remember the promises he had read in the Bible. This didn't happen by chance. It was the result of the consistency he was building. The absence of strong emotions no longer frightened him as much. He understood that faith wasn't a fleeting feeling, but a solid foundation on which he could build his life. Before, he needed to feel God to believe he was near. Now, he knew that God was with him regardless of what he felt. This gave him a new sense of security, a peace that didn't depend on circumstances. Still, there were moments of struggle, days when his mind tried to convince him that nothing was changing, but he chose to remain steadfast. Over time, Lucas began to notice something different in the way he responded to difficulties. Before, every problem seemed too big, and he felt alone. Now he found strength in what he was learning through his daily Bible reading. Verses that once seemed like random words now made sense in his life. When fear crept in, he remembered, "Do not fear, for I am with you." Isaiah 41:10. When anxiety tried to overwhelm him, he repeated to himself, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." 1 Peter 5:7. These promises started shaping his way of thinking. He realized he didn't need to wait for a special church service to feel God's presence. It was there all the time, in his word and prayer, and even in the small details of everyday life. This didn't mean he would never have doubts or hard days, but now he knew where to find strength. His faith was becoming more solid because it no longer depended on what he felt in the moment, but on the unchanging truth of God. Even so, Lucas still faced challenges. He saw friends who seemed to have deep emotional experiences with God, and at times he felt a slight desire to go back to relying on those feelings. But then, he remembered everything he had learned. He began to understand that what we feel doesn't always reflect spiritual reality. God isn't more present when we feel something intense, nor less present when everything seems quiet. This new understanding gave him a different kind of joy, not a fleeting happiness, but a deep confidence. Days passed, and without realizing it, Lucas was becoming more spiritually mature. He still had a lot to learn, but he was no longer the same boy who thought his faith depended on emotional moments. Now he was beginning to understand that true faith is sustained by knowing who God is and by choosing to trust him, even when feelings don't align. This discovery was transforming his life from the inside out, making him more secure and stable. Although doubts still appeared occasionally, Lucas knew he was on the right path. His faith was being strengthened, not by what he felt, but by what he knew to be true. He didn't know exactly where this journey would lead him, but he was willing to keep walking. After all, now he understood that faith isn't about feeling, it's about trusting. What came next, he didn't know, but he was ready to keep learning and growing. One afternoon, Lucas met his friend Gabriel at the park near his house. The two of them usually talked about all kinds of things, but that day, Gabriel seemed down. After a few minutes of silence, he sighed and said, "You know, sometimes I feel like my faith is weak. During church services, everything makes sense, but when the week starts, it's like God feels distant." Lucas immediately related to those words because he had gone through the same struggle. Instead of giving a quick answer, he looked at his friend and asked, "Have you ever thought that faith doesn't have to depend on what we feel?" Gabriel furrowed his brow, looking confused. "What do you mean?" "I always thought that feeling, God's presence, was proof that he was with me." Lucas smiled slightly, remembering his own journey. "I used to think that too," he admitted. "But then I started realizing that God doesn't change just because my heart feels silent. What sustains our faith isn't fleeting emotions, but the truth of His word. Gabriel sat quietly, absent-mindedly playing with a small rock on the ground. So if I don't feel anything, I can still be sure that God is with me? Lucas nodded. Yes. God doesn't leave us just because we don't feel chills or intense emotions. He promised to be with us every day, no matter what we feel. Look at what Jesus said in Matthew 28:20. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. Gabriel looked at him, a new light in his eyes. But how do I trust that when it feels like nothing is happening? Lucas thought for a moment before answering. It was hard at first, but I started praying and reading the Bible every day even when I didn't feel like it. And you know what happened? I realized that God was always there, even in the quiet moments. Gabriel sighed. I think I rely too much on church services to feel like God is with me. But during the week when problems show up, everything feels different. Lucas knew exactly what he meant. I used to be the same way, he said. But I learned that faith needs to be like deep roots. If it only depends on emotional moments, any difficulty can pull it out. But if it's built on truth, nothing can shake it. Gabriel stayed silent for a moment, processing those words. After a while, Gabriel looked at Lucas and gave a small smile. I never thought about it that way before. I guess I wanted to feel something all the time just to be sure that God was with me. Lucas laughed. Me too. But you know what I realized? God doesn't only reveal Himself in intense moments. Sometimes He reveals Himself in silence, in peace, in the understanding that grows little by little. Gabriel nodded, deep in thought. So I need to learn to trust more and not rely only on what I feel? Lucas patted his friend's shoulder. Exactly. It's not easy, but it's worth it. And it doesn't mean that God will never give us emotional moments. He can do that. But our faith can't depend only on those experiences. It has to be strong, built on who God is. Gabriel smiled, looking relieved. I think I need to change the way I see faith. Lucas nodded. It's a journey, but you're not alone. God is with you, always. As they continued talking, Gabriel seemed lighter, like someone who had just discovered something precious. But that conversation wasn't over yet, and that journey was only just beginning. Over time, Lucas began to realize that walking with God wasn't something occasional, but a continuous journey. He understood that true faith wasn't just about living through emotional moments, but about being with God every day, in every moment. He started seeing his routine differently, recognizing that God was with him not only during church services or intense prayers, but also in the small daily tasks. He began to feel that by doing things with dedication and a sincere heart, he was honoring God, even without experiencing overwhelming emotions. Lucas started wondering if those intense moments of worship and prayer were actually just special moments God used to strengthen his faith, rather than its foundation. He came to understand that the real tests of faith happened outside the church, in everyday situations. How he reacted to difficulties, how he demonstrated patience, love, and perseverance in hard times, those were the actions that truly reflected his faith. Emotions could come and go, but the daily testimony of how he lived his life with God was what truly mattered. As he reflected on this, Lucas felt a sense of freedom. He realized that he no longer needed to worry about the lack of strong feelings or chase emotional experiences to feel connected to God. He began to understand that God was always present, even when he didn't feel anything extraordinary. True faith wasn't based on what he felt, but on what he knew to be true about who God is and whom he chose to trust every single day. This realization started bringing more peace to his heart. In the days that followed, Lucas focused on being faithful to his daily commitment to God, without worrying about how or when he would reveal himself. With every Bible reading, every prayer, even in quiet moments without deep emotions, he began to feel something new. He started to see that by dedicating himself to these moments, he was building a solid foundation that didn't rely on feelings, but on belief. He became more centered, more steadfast in his trust in God's promises, no longer shaken by the absence of emotion. Looking back, Lucas realized that his pursuit of intense feelings had distracted him from the main focus, being faithful to God, even on ordinary days. He no longer wanted to depend on emotions to justify his faith. He understood that walking with God was a daily journey of trust, and that consistency in prayer, scripture reading, and practicing love toward others was what would keep him strong. He began to appreciate the beauty of a more mature faith, one that didn't need emotional roller coasters to be genuine. During church services, Lucas still experienced deep moments of worship, but now he knew that wasn't the core of his Christian life. Those moments were like fuel, a boost for his journey, but not the reason for his faith. He understood that even when feelings weren't present, he was still living for God, and that was more than enough. The true walk of faith didn't happen only in emotional highs, but in the consistency of the small steps he took each day. In conversations with friends, Lucas shared this new perspective. He explained that emotional ups and downs didn't define his relationship with God. "If you depend only on emotions, it will never be enough," he would say. True faith comes from unwavering trust in God's promises and the daily commitment to live according to His will. He felt that more and more his faith was becoming deeper and stronger, like a rock that, despite the winds and storms, remained firm. But he knew that his journey with God still had many chapters ahead. During a special church service, Lucas once again found himself immersed in an atmosphere of worship. The music flowed gently, and the voices of the congregation filled the temple with sincere praise. In the past, he would have surrendered to that moment, expecting to feel something extraordinary, but now his perspective was different. He was there not to seek an intense emotion, but to recognize and give thanks for God's constant presence in his life. However, as he closed his eyes and poured his heart into worship, he realized something profound. God's presence surrounded him in a different way, not like a passing wave, but like an embrace that had always been there. Lucas felt his heart warm, not out of a need to confirm his faith through feelings, but because he understood that God had been present all along. The emotion came, but not like before. This time it wasn't a starting point, but a reflection of a solid faith. He no longer depended on these moments to feel close to God, but when they happened, they became a celebration of what already existed within him. With his eyes closed and a gentle smile on his face, Lucas simply gave thanks, without rush, without fear of losing that feeling. During the prayer, the pastor spoke about God's presence not being limited to a church service or a strong emotion. Lucas listened attentively and realized that his journey had truly changed. Before, he had felt like he needed those moments to recharge, as if his faith depended on experiencing something extraordinary. Now he knew that true faith wasn't built on emotional highs, but on trusting that God was present even when there were no grand manifestations. Still, feeling that presence again was like a gift, a loving reminder that God continued to work in his life. As the worship continued, Lucas looked around and noticed that people were experiencing that moment in different ways. Some were crying, others raised their hands, and some simply sang with their eyes closed. He understood that everyone had their own journey with God, and that their emotions might differ, but that didn't make anyone's experience less valid. He himself had gone through a phase of wanting to feel something intense all the time. But now he understood that what mattered most was the consistency of his relationship with God, regardless of how he felt in the moment. When the service ended, Lucas walked out of the church feeling a different kind of peace. It wasn't euphoria. It wasn't an overwhelming emotion. It was a quiet, steady certainty that God was with him. He smiled as he remembered how he had struggled with this before, searching for answers in emotions rather than in the truth of God's word. Now he no longer worried about the absence of strong feelings, because he understood that true faith was so much greater than that. But when those moments did come, he could simply embrace them as a gift rather than a test of his spirituality. Throughout the week, Lucas reflected on that experience. He realized that when he stopped chasing emotions as proof of God's presence, that's when God revealed himself in a deeper and more genuine way. It reminded him of rain after a long drought. Not something he could control, but something that came at the right time, in the moment God had determined. He understood that his journey wasn't about constantly waiting for those rains, but about trusting that even in dry seasons, the source never runs dry. He didn't know when he would have another intense experience like that, but now it no longer concerned him. His faith was rooted in something far stronger than fleeting emotions. From that day on, Lucas decided that whenever those moments came, he would receive them with gratitude. But on ordinary days, when everything felt silent, he would remain steadfast, knowing that God was with him every day, and that certainty was worth more than any passing emotion. As Lucas walked out of church that night, he felt something different inside him. It wasn't a fleeting euphoria or an emotion that would soon fade, but a deep and steady peace. He realized that this feeling didn't come just from the service or the music, but from a firm certainty within him. God was always present regardless of what he felt. For the first time, Lucas walked without fear of losing his connection with God because he understood that this connection didn't depend on emotions, but on a sincere and daily pursuit. In the following days, he noticed that his spiritual routine had changed. Praying and reading the Bible were no longer tasks done out of obligation or in hopes of feeling something intense. Now, he sought God with a willing heart, knowing that a relationship with the Lord was built on consistency and trust. Some days were more emotional than others, but that no longer shook him. He had learned that true faith was not like a flame dependent on the wind, but like a solid rock that stood firm regardless of the circumstances. Lucas also began to notice this transformation in other areas of his life. He became more patient with his family, more understanding with his friends, and less anxious about the future. Before, he believed he could only feel God in moments of great emotion. But now he saw that God's presence was in the little details of daily life, in a sincere prayer, in a verse that spoke to his heart, in a simple moment of gratitude. God was not only in the emotional church services, but also in the quiet routines and small acts of faith. When he met his friend again, Lucas shared his journey and everything he had learned. He explained that faith was not a roller coaster of emotions, but a daily walk where every step mattered. His friend listened attentively, and with a smile, admitted that he too often felt insecure when he didn't experience strong emotions. Lucas encouraged him to seek God consistently, without depending on emotions, and he saw in his friend's eyes a spark of understanding, as if he too was beginning to see faith from a new perspective. As time passed, Lucas realized that his new understanding of God made him more stable and confident. There were difficult days, moments of doubt and challenges, but now he knew where his faith was rooted. He no longer sought fleeting experiences, but rather a deep and lasting relationship with God. The emotions still came from time to time, and when they did, He welcomed them with joy. But even when he didn't feel them, his certainty in God remained unshakable. He finally understood what the pastor meant when he said that faith is based on the Word, not on feelings. Looking back, Lucas saw how much he had grown spiritually. That internal struggle, that restless search to feel something, had transformed into a quiet confidence. He now understood that God was with him not only in moments of great emotion, but in every moment of his life. This brought him lasting peace, a certainty that did not waver with his emotions. He no longer needed to prove to himself that God was present. He simply knew. That night, as he lay down, Lucas prayed differently. Instead of asking to feel God's presence, he simply gave thanks. He thanked God for every lesson, for every moment of doubt that led him to a stronger faith, and for every day that God had been with him, even when he hadn't noticed. And with a heart at peace, he fell asleep, knowing that his journey with God was only beginning, but now on much firmer and more secure foundations. My dear brothers and sisters, what a wonderful story we've just witnessed. Lucas's journey teaches us that true faith is not based on fleeting emotions, but on the certainty that God is always with us. How many times do we seek emotions to feel that God is near when in reality He has never left us? A firm and unshakable faith is born from the consistency of our walk with the Lord. And now, I, Prophet Eli, want to speak a word of blessing over your life. May the Lord strengthen your faith each day. May you find peace in His presence, and may your spiritual journey not depend on moments but on a deep and true relationship with God. I declare that you will be sustained by the word of the Lord. You will grow in grace and you will experience His faithfulness in every area of your life. Hallelujah. If this message touched your heart, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us share this word with more people. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next video. May God bless you powerfully.